Okay, so in this last video from Module 1, I'm going to go over how to set up image planes and how to add the reference images that you create to those image planes to use as your guide for modeling, and then how to create, arrange, move, rotate, and scale primitives to match the basic shapes depicted in the reference images of your prop. So before I create these planes for the image planes, I want to go over the snapping tools, and this will allow me to snap to various elements in the interface. So that is the button on the menu bar that looks like a 3 with a magnet in the corner of it. It's called the snaps toggle. When it is initiated, it's blue. When it's not turned on, it's not blue. I would suggest you try to keep it on by default, but there are going to be times when you don't want it on. And then right-clicking on the same button will bring up the grid and snap settings. By default, the snap settings are snap just to the grid points. And that's a good idea to keep them on. I like to turn on vertices as well. You can also snap to the pivot points, which we'll go over in a later video, to edges on polygonal objects or segments on splines, or the middle of faces or polygons on polygonal models. You may at some point want to turn those on, but for right now, I would suggest you keep grid points and vertices snapped. And then just close that window, and then every time I turn this on or turn it off, those settings will remain. Now, when I drag this plane to create it, and I'm going to do that by going to the Create panel on my command panel here, make sure that I'm in the Geometry and then Standard Primitives from the drop-down menu, which is the default, and I'm going to choose Plane here. And you're going to see now as I move my cursor over the grid, it's snapping to these grid points. Any intersection between the grid lines, my cursor is snapping to that. So I'm going to create a plane here that goes from the corner of one, and as I drag it, you see it snaps to each grid point, and once I get to where I want it, let it go and press enter. You can hide or show the edged faces, which allows you to see the divisions or the edges that make up the model even when it's not selected, is the F4 key on your keyboard. So toggling that on and off will show those edged faces. So I'll keep them on just so you can see here. So by default, the plane is set to be 4x4. I don't need that resolution. These are simply flat planes that are going to display images, so I don't need any more divisions than one in each direction. So set that down because you want to try to keep the resolution as low as possible, and there's no reason for that extra geometry to be there. But I also want to note that I created a square plane, and that's because I created my reference images, which I have loaded into the scene asset subfolder, and then even a subfolder under that called images, and that's where I place my reference images for my image planes, and that's where 3ds Max is going to look for those images. Now, I created all of my image planes to be square pixels. They're all 700 by 700 pixels, and I chose that simply because that was the lowest resolution I could use to get all the detail I needed. And you want to keep these as low as possible because you don't want it to bog down your scene or to cause you to crash, because if there's a lot of large images in your scene, it can cause your software to crash. And it's a good idea to use square images. And that way, when you create the planes, the only thing you have to worry about in terms of their length and width is that they're square, so that the length matches the width, no matter how big your images are. So if these images were 512 by 512 or 256 by 256 or 1200 by 1200 pixels, it doesn't really matter because as long as the length and the width are the same in the plane, these square image planes will apply to those image planes correctly. If you created reference images that were not square pixels, then you would have to make sure that the length and width of the planes to which you're going to apply them match that aspect ratio. So if the aspect ratio of the images were 4:3, the aspect ratio of the plane to which you want to apply it would also have to be 4:3. And I took all of these into Photoshop and made sure that all of the images were the same scale in relation to one another. So when I bring them into 3ds Max, I know that when I arrange them, they're all going to start out the same size as long as all the planes are the same size, the images are the same size. When I apply them by going to the Modify panel, and I'm going to call it Headphones Top Image Plane. And now I want to create copies of this for the other image planes. So I'll create the front image plane first. First, let's discuss the options you have when copying or cloning objects in 3ds Max. The Control V hotkey will bring up the clone options, and the first one we'll go over is the copy. It's the simplest to understand. When you copy an object, there's no connection between the original and the copy. So if I increase the length segments on the original, you can see it has no effect on the copy. By the same token, if I increase the length segments on the copy, you can see that has no effect on the original. So when you create a simple copy, you copy the object in its current state, and there's no connection between the original and the copied version. The second option is the instance. When you create an instance copy, there's a two-way connection between them. So anything I do to the original will affect the copy, and anything I do to the copy will affect the original. Lastly is the reference option. This is sort of a cross between the copy and instance. When you create a reference copy, the connection is one way. Anything you do to the original will affect the copy, but nothing you do to the copy will affect the original. So for example, if I were to add a bend modifier to the copy, you can see it has no effect on the original. However, if I were to add that bend to the original, you can see that it affects the copy. So when you create a reference copy, there's a connection in one direction. Anything you do to the original will affect the copy, but nothing you do to the copy will affect the original. So there's differences between the instance and reference. There are different situations where you'd want to use one or the other. So it's important to understand those differences. For these purposes, I just want to make straight copies. So I'll hit Control V again, choose the copy option, and that will make just a pure copy. There's no connection between these two planes now. So I'm going to name this one front image plane. Now what I want to do is rotate it up so that it's facing the camera in this front view. I'm going to rotate it in the x-axis. But before I do that, I want to be able to set the pivot for the object because I want to be able to rotate it from the bottom. And that gives us a chance to go over how the pivots work in 3ds Max. I want to change the pivot point for this object. So in order to do that, I'll go to the Hierarchy panel and I'll click the button that says Effect Pivot Only. And now I can move that pivot without moving the actual object. In 3ds Max, the snapping tools by default, they snap in all three directions. So when I try to drag this, it's going to snap to any of these grid points, and I want it to be down there. But if I wanted to snap only along the y-axis or the x-axis or the z-axis, I can't do that right now. But there is a way to do that in 3ds Max. We have to turn on something over here on the right. You can't see it. It's off the screen. You can see these little like two lines of perforation here. That whenever you see those anywhere on the menu bar, that lets you know that there's some hidden elements there that you can't see. So I'm going to drag that to the left, and I'll bring up this button that says Enable Access Constraints and Snaps Toggle. And that means that you can snap to individual axes. So I'm going to turn that on, and I suggest you leave it on the whole time. So now I'm going to drag just in the Y here and drag it down to the bottom of the plane. I'll click Effect Pivot again to turn that off. So now I want to move this plane in the y-axis to the middle of the grid, and then I'm going to rotate it up in that x-axis. Now, when I rotate here, I can rotate manually, and it's just rotating however much I drag my mouse. I could also put a number into the field down here at the bottom to rotate it 90 degrees exactly in that x-axis. But I can also use the snapping with rotation, and I do that with the angle snap toggle up here. So again, just like the 3D snaps toggle, clicking it turns it blue. That lets you know that it's on. And then again, right-clicking on it will bring up the grid and snap settings. The only one you really have to worry about here is the angle field. By default, it's set to 5 degrees, and that's a good number to keep it at. So that will allow me to rotate this, and each time it's going 5 degrees, 45, 50, 55, 60. And I'm going to get that up until it's at 90. So now I have this image plane in the front view here. I'm going to save this file now because I wouldn't want to lose this work. And now I have 3 planes set up here, 3 image planes, one for the top view, one for the front view, and one for the side view. Okay, so now I want to add the images to these planes. In order to do that, I'm going to have to work with the material editor. Now we'll get into the material editor in greater detail later on in the course when it comes time to shade and texture your prop. But for right now, we're just going to use it to add some images to these planes. So the hotkey for the material editor is M. And that will bring this up. There are 2 modes that you can view your editor. The compact mode, which for right now all we really need to do is pretty simple. So we'll stick with the compact view. And I'm going to create the first material here. Just choose any open slot. I'm going to call this headphones front image plane. You want to set the self-illumination up to 100. That will make it easier to see when we apply the images to it. In order to apply the reference image to this material, I need to add it as a map. Down at the bottom here, under Maps, I'm going to add it to the diffuse color channel, and that's the color channel for the material. So I'm going to click this button where it says it has no map assigned to it, double click on the bitmap, and this will bring me directly into the Scene Assets Images folder in my project directory. And for this one, I'm going to choose the side profile of the cup because that's the front view of the headphones as a whole. Open, and then I'm going to drag this material to the front image planes. And you'll see that the image doesn't show up automatically, so we have to show the maps in the viewport. There's a button for that right here, so I'll see that image now shows up in my view. So now I have 3 of my image planes set up, the front view, side view, and top view. But I took some additional reference images. I had a front view of just the band, and then I had those three views of the peripherals on the cord, the volume hub, the splitter, and then the USB and the headphone jack. So I'd want to be able to move these so that they pass each other right in the middle. The band, it's more over toward the middle. So I'm going to arrange these to set up the way that the headphones look in real life and that they all match up to create the headphones as a whole. So as you can see, I've arranged all of the image planes. I have the two images of the cup that cross each other in the middle. The front and top images of the band line up with each other. And then over here, I've set up the three image planes for the peripherals. I'm going to model those after I complete the rest of the headphones. So I've moved those image planes away from the rest of the scene for now. I've also grouped the images and named them. Grouping is just simply a matter of selecting the objects you want, hitting Control G, and then naming that group. And I'll end up hiding those to begin with, again, which I can do through the Scene Explorer by clicking the eye icon. And I'll begin modeling the headphones first. Okay, so now I'm going to go about setting up some primitives for the various shapes that make up this particular prop. And the goals of this exercise are threefold. One, you're going to get comfortable creating primitives. Two, you're going to get comfortable moving, rotating, scaling those primitives, using the snap tools to move things more precisely, the angle snap tool to rotate things more precisely. And then three, and maybe most importantly, you're starting to learn how to pick out the most appropriate primitive for the shapes that make up your particular object. And that's a really important skill because generally speaking, if you can begin with a primitive rather than starting a model from scratch, it's a good idea to do that because the primitives give you surface area to work with. So anytime you're working with geometric shapes that are perfect circles, perfect ellipses, right angles, those are oftentimes much easier to achieve by beginning with a primitive rather than starting the model from scratch on your own, because creating right angles and creating perfect circles or perfect ellipses is time consuming. Okay, first I'm going to hide some of these image planes. Maybe having one or two on screen will make it a little bit clearer for you to see what I'm working on. A quick note about how to work with groups. So right now, and by default, when you create a group, it's a closed group, which means that when you select it, I can only get to the group itself. If I try to select one of these individual image planes, I'm only getting the group. So in order to work with the elements that are contained in each group, you have to open them. Selecting the group and going to the group menu and opening them allows me to select the individual group members. There's also an option to open recursively, and that is when you have groups that are under other groups. Open will open only the group that you select, whereas open recursively will open all of the groups contained under that group node. Okay, so I'm going to start with this element here. I'll show it to you in the pictures. It's sort of a slightly rounded shape. There's different levels to it. It's flat at this area, and then it begins to indent. And then these two levels here, they're flat. If you had to guess about which primitive to begin with for this shape, there are a couple of different options. A sphere might be an option. And hopefully you can see that it would be a little bit difficult for me to flatten out the shape that's in the middle of this one. So while I get the nice rounded area here, this level is flat here, and then it starts to go inward. So it would take me some time to take those areas and flatten them. So a sphere is probably not the best object to start with. So a cylinder, I think, is probably going to give us the easiest way to do this. So when I create this cylinder, I want to set its options, so I need 7 different sections. So I chose 2 cap segments. The cap segments are the number of segments along the flat face at the front of the cylinder. So I chose 2 for there because there's 2 flat sections here. And then there are 5 additional sections. So I chose 5 segments to go around the profile of the cylinder. And around the sides, which are the number of segments that go around the circumference of the cylinder, I set that to 16. And the reason I do that is I want to be able to, as we talked about at the beginning, I want to model half of one of the cups, mirror that over, and then make a copy of that to model the other cup. So I want to be able to cut the shape in half. If I choose something like 15, I can't cut this directly down the middle, right? There's no line going down the middle. So I want to use an even number around here so I have a nice hard line that runs down the center so that I can cut this in half eventually. So that would be my first primitive that I would create for this part of the object. So I would just move it. And if you want to look through your objects, the hotkey for see-through, which you can also get to on the display panel down here, the hotkey for see-through is Alt and X, and it's a little bit easier to use the hotkey rather than having to go to the display panel. And this hotkey to make it opaque again is also Alt X. And for this first 3ds Max assignment, that's all you're doing. You're creating and arranging primitives, moving them to match your reference images, select the primitive that's most appropriate for the shapes depicted in your reference images, and then setting the parameters to get you started in the best possible way for what you want to eventually do with those primitives. So the next shape I'm going to tackle is the one that makes up this outside of the cup. And I won't be able to create the entire thing with one primitive. So I'll probably create this section down here with one, and then this section up here with another. And this is another instance where there's probably a couple of choices to consider. A box might work. And then scale it. And when you scale objects, you have three choices. You can scale uniformly, which allows you to scale all three axes at one time. You can scale non-uniformly, which allows you to scale axes independently. And then you have squash, which allows you to squash or stretch. So in this instance, I want to be able to scale the axes indiscriminately, so I'll choose the non-uniform scale. You could make a case for saying the cube might work. But again, it's a little bit difficult to make those rounded shapes than it is to make the right angles. So I actually think a cylinder, again, is going to be the right choice, because if we look at the images, so back to the images quickly, there's this outer section, and it's flat along the back of it. And then there's one level that goes out, and there's one level that indents, and then another flat level. So there's the outer layer, and then there's an indentation, and then this flattened part. So to get that indentation and the flat area, the best way to accomplish that is the cylinder. So for the cylinder, this would be the cap area. So that would want the cap segments here to be 1, and then I'd need 1 segment, and then 2 segments. There's actually a small flat section that goes along the profile of it. So in fact, I would need 1, 2, 3 on the profile. And I'll keep this size at 16 because, again, I want to be able to cut the cup in half and mirror the other side. So I want that straight line just like we did for the first section. And I'll save my scene so I don't lose my work. The band. To create the bend in the cube is going to take some modeling that we'll get to next time, but I would want to create a cube that is about the same length and width as that band. And then finally I'll make these sections here that are the pads. These are pretty straightforward. They're essentially toruses. And on the headphones themselves, the interior of these torus areas are indented. So that's going to be easier to create with a torus than it would be with a sphere. And then I'm just going to make a duplicate of this one to get the second pad. It's going to be easier for me to set the pivot point to the back of this. I can snap it to the back of the original section. And I'll save my scene so I don't lose my work. But that's the basic idea of this assignment. The goals are threefold: to get used to working with the primitives, choosing the best primitive for the shape that you're trying to represent, moving, rotating, and scaling with the gizmo, with the different reference coordinate systems, with uniform, non-uniform scale, moving in 1, 2, and 3 axes at a time, scaling in 1, 2, and 3 axes at a time, and then arranging the primitives to fit together as close as you can. So that's really the goals of this first 3ds Max assignment in the course.